Conecte-se com grandes nomes da área da saúde e dos negócios.
Matricule-se na Pós-Graduação de Saúde Mental, Atenção Psicossocial e Psicologia Hospitalar. As doenças e transtornos mentais afetam mais de 400 milhões de pessoas em todo o mundo. E é urgente que os conhecimentos em saúde mental sejam aprofundados. Vem se especializar na área e amplie seus conhecimentos e práticas sobre o tema.
As aulas contarão com grandes nomes da área da gestão e saúde que compartilharão seus conhecimentos práticos e teóricos. Este é o seu time de professores.
Daniel Goleman, maior referência em inteligência emocional do mundo. Carla Ceppo, referência em neurociência no Brasil, professora, escritora e pesquisadora. Luiz Henrique Mandetta, médico e ex-ministro da Saúde. Andrew Solomon, referência mundial em psicologia, autor do best-seller O Demônio do Meio-Dia. Jairo Bauer, médico psiquiatra, biólogo e publisher de conteúdo em saúde. Fábio Leite Gastal, superintendente de novos negócios na Seguros Unimed. Sigmar Malvese, livre docente USP, PhD em Organizational Behavior.
How many of you have had in your own life or in a friend's life someone who has gone through chemotherapy? And you will all know that in your own life or in your friend's life, you've all asked the same question: why me with cancer? And why me? Why my friend with cancer? Why my mother? Why my child? In 1986, an audience, not unlike this audience, was asked to name the words that brought the most fear into their hearts. Two words came up: shark and cancer. I'm not going to talk about sharks today, but I will talk about cancer. Interlaced into my talk today, I will also want to talk about genes and how that idea of heredity is changing our view not only of cancer but of all other diseases, many other diseases. And it's the link between genes and cancer, and the link between genes and other illnesses and the future. I want to begin with a quote that I think summarizes where we are and also some of the challenges. A world in which cancer is normalized as a manageable chronic condition would be a wonderful thing. But a risk factor world in which we all think of ourselves as precancerous would not be. It might decrease the incidence of some forms of malignancy, hugely increasing the number of healthy people under medical treatment, because all of us would have future anxieties about whether we are going to develop cancer in the future or not. And the final thing he says, it's very interesting and a lovely idea. It would be a strange victory in which the price to be paid for checking the spread of cancer through the body is its uncontrolled spread through the culture. So the more we, in some ways, the more we control the spread of cancer in individuals in our own bodies, The question is, are we reinforcing, making more possible, making even greater, dilating the influence of cancer in our culture? Was cancer going to become one word that our children will know from 2 years old or 4 years old? To summarize what the progress has been made, the first point is that we are now finally, after many years, beginning to understand cancer at a cellular and a molecular level. And one of the tasks that I want to do today is to explain to you what that understanding has brought. What does it mean to have cancer? Why is it relevant? Number two, this understanding has highlighted the enormous diversity of individual cancers. 2 women who have the same breast cancer. By same, I mean it looks the same under a microscope. It is in the same location. The size is the same. The spread is the same. If you look at those 2 cancers under the genetic microscope, if you ask the question, what genes have been changed in these 2 cancers, they're not the same. There is no other disease that we know of in human history, no other disease, where the diversity of the individual examples of the disease is as much as the number of patients with the disease. Cancer is a disease in which every single example of cancer is a unique individual example of cancer. Your cancer is different from her cancer, is different from her cancer. That might demand what we are now calling precision or individualized therapies. We cannot have individualized therapies for every human being. That would mean inventing 6 billion cancer medicines. We cannot have that. So I say partially individualized. We have to match the genetic components of one cancer with the therapy, the genetic components of the second cancer with a different therapy. The themes of how to control cancer in its future is prevention, detecting early, and treating precisely. These are the 3 themes that have emerged, I think, in the last 10 to 15 years of cancer therapy. And it's like a pyramid. Prevention is the base of the pyramid for countries like Brazil, countries like India. The base of the pyramid has to be as wide and broad as possible, because that is, of course, the base. We want to prevent as many cancers as possible. The center of the pyramid is early detection, to detect cancers early, and only the top of the pyramid is treating, because the expenditure in treating cancers has grown exponentially, and many other places are having a very hard time treating the top of the pyramid. So the base of the pyramid has to be broadened. And the point that I was made earlier, however, as we do this, as we prevent more, as we detect more cancers early, such a world of surveillance, diagnosis, and treatment carries cultural burdens that I suspect that we are still unprepared for. Prevention, the most important of all. Identifying new carcinogenic states. I've capitalized the word states because, of course, prevention involves finding new things in the environment like cigarette smoke or X-rays or other things, asbestos, poisons, toxins in the environment that cause cancer. And we are still hunting for those. But we're now realizing that it's not just things outside, it's things inside the body that also are responsible for increases in risk of cancer. The second aspect of this pyramid is early detection. Early detection, identifying the earliest signs of cancer in the body using new technologies. There's a particular one that I want to focus on called a liquid biopsy. When you have a cancer let's say you have a cancer in your hand, the cells that are growing, they spill. They release small little bits of genetic material from them as they die. This circulates in your blood in tiny, 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 tiny amounts. So small that in the past we couldn't detect it. But now we have new technologies that allow us to detect this small amount of cancer even before it's visible. And the question is, can we use that to detect cancer earlier? And number 3, treatment. Again, using genetics and physiology to use new treatment paradigms and new ways of thinking about treatment. One thing I want to emphasize in all of this is that we still are extremely unsure about one of the most major modalities of human physiology, which is diet. This is a problem in disease in general. We are hyper-focused on particular mechanisms, for good reason, that these diseases might be affected by molecules that we call drugs. But strangely enough, we have neglected for many years the effect of profound forms of molecular interventions in our body. One important idea in history of cancer, now going back many thousands of years, is that we used to think of cancer as something that came from outside the body, came from outside and inhabited the body. That's not true. We now know that's not true. The locus of cancer occurs within the body. And it has brought a new vocabulary of the disease. I want to focus on some of these words, which will now enter not your vocabulary, but the vocabulary of your children. The first one is previvor. I've heard this first from a patient of mine. A previvor is a survivor of a disease that you haven't had yet. Some people find it funny, but it's a word that is entering the vocabulary of cancer because you are becoming, even if you are cured from one cancer, you are a previvor of your next cancer. The second word I want to call out is scanxiety. This is a word also I heard from a patient. Scanxiety is having anxiety about your next scan. Every patient that I see has scanxiety. It's a word that we will become familiar with because we will enter this world of diagnosis, pre-surveillance, and surveillance and treatment. And the final word is something you saw, a celebration as you enter this kind of world, a haircut party, or some other mechanism by which cancer patients are finding communities within themselves, finding ways to connect on social media, on Facebook, on other kinds of mechanisms that they're collecting with each other and finding new vocabularies, finding ways to talk, finding ways for advocacy around cancer. Some people think cancer is a modern disease, it's a new disease. It's absolutely not true. It is obviously one of the most ancient diseases known to human beings. Why is it a modern disease now? Because we are living longer. That's the main reason. It's a disease that occurs in the double negative. When we kill all the other killers, what's left is cancer. It is in fact an ironic sign of our success against other diseases. But for the most part, the cancer is a disease of ancient origin. This is an ancient document, probably the first document that we know from human history, a medical document of human history, and there's a mention of a word, of a disease that is very similar. It has no name and no treatment. The word cancer and the idea of the crab comes much later. It comes from the Greeks, from about 400, 500 BC, and apparently Hippocrates thought of that name cancer, because he thought that the tumors looked like crabs underneath the skin. And when they spread, it was like the spread of the blood vessels, the spread of a crab's legs around the blood vessel. And hence, that's how the word cancer comes around. The main tumor, and then it's spreading tentacles, much like a crab. What was the reason for cancer to occur in the first place? Why did cancer happen? And one thing was very clear. The most important realization came in the late 1800s when doctors began to realize that cancer was the overproliferation, the overgrowth of a cell. Now, you could say, well, why do cells overgrow? Where do they come from? Well, one thing that was very clear is that it came from a normal cell. A normal cell suddenly decided to stop knowing when to stop growing. A normal cell decided that it could no longer stop growing, and therefore it started becoming a cancer cell. The mystery of cancer was, why is it that these cells don't stop growing? That signal, starting and stopping growing, is a fundamental feature of cellular physiology. If we didn't have these signals to start and stop, we would start becoming like trees. We would start growing branches, right? But we don't, and that's because our form as adult organisms, is restricted by cells that know when to stop growing. Your 5 fingers are formed and then it's done. In a cancer cell, the first thing you need to realize, in a cancer cell, those signals to stop growing have been broken. And it's a little bit like having a car where the accelerator has been jammed or the brakes have been snapped. So the accelerator is always telling the car to move forward, in this case the cell to keep growing, and the brakes have been snapped, and so there are no brakes anymore, so the cell keeps growing. So the question then becomes, how do the accelerators get jammed and the brakes get snapped? And there were 4 theories, and you need to know these 4 theories because they will all converge on the right answer. Heredity, environment, chance, and viruses converge on one thing, which is genes. The problem of identity is that every cancer that we know of occurs because of the alteration of genetic apparatus of a normal cell. And therefore, every cancer cell is extremely close to a normal cell. Only a few genes have been changed. Otherwise, for all intents and purposes, it is a normal cell. That's problem number one. This is the problem of identity. This is one of the major problems of trying to solve the problem of cancer. That the cancer cell is so close to us in its biology, in its physiology, that it's very hard to make a medicine that will not kill your normal cells, but will only kill the jammed cells. Imagine a medicine that will not obstruct normal growth, but only obstruct cancer growth. The problem number two in cancer is this one. And unlike problem one, I call that identity. This one's called diversity. Human beings, we all have about 23,000 genes. Actually, quite a small number of genes. It's a big genome, 3 billion letters in our genome, but around 23,000 genes in these 3 billion letters. Imagine that this is the normal human genome. One person, let's pick someone from the audience, I'm sorry. This is your normal human genome. It's a blank sheet of paper. All the genes are correct, and therefore it's a blank sheet of paper. Let's imagine that this person unfortunately develops breast cancer. Let's say it's a woman, she develops breast cancer, and as I said before, some genes get altered, yeah? Some genes get mutated or altered, and this is what happens. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 genes are altered in this one woman with breast cancer. These genes, as I told you before, are going to make the cell now unable to stop dividing, continue to divide, and therefore start spreading in the body. A second woman also has breast cancer, looks the same in every other way. She comes to your clinic, you do the same exercise, and you ask the question, what genes are altered in this woman's breast cancer? And the answer is this. The point is that they're not the same. Some genes are common, 1 or 2, 2 or 3, but some are unique to the second woman with breast cancer. This is the problem I was pointing out before. Every individual specimen of cancer has its own genetic fingerprint. Identity and diversity, the two faces of cancer that made it extraordinarily difficult for us to think of treatment, prevention, and early detection. It's hard to detect early because you have to find the few changes in the cell that are not normal. It's hard to detect early because you have to find one person's fingerprint is not the same as the second person's fingerprint. It's hard to treat because this cancer cell is being driven by different sets of genetic determinants than this cancer cell. These are the fundamental problems that we have been grappling with, and that's why it's been so difficult. In previous times, we used to use a kind of loose way to try to find people who are at risk of cancer. We used to use history, we used to use exposure, we used to ask questions about heredity. But these were very loose questions. What we're trying to do now is to ask the question, can I, for an individual human being, can I get a sense of their risk? And how can I get a sense of their risk? Well, there are 2 or 3 things that help. One is, of course, their exposures help. Have you been exposed to a particular kind of toxin? Have you been exposed to a particular carcinogen? That helps. But one of the most powerful things that helps is genetics and these risk states, obesity, inflammation, etc. I want to talk much more now about genetics and more about this finding of a risk state as mechanisms of early detection in cancer. Notice how the paradigm is shifting away now from treating everyone indiscriminately. It is shifting towards, can you find a state? Can you do surveillance? Can you find genetic risks that will allow me to detect cancer, in particular people with greater degree of surveillance compared to everyone else? And for a long time, we thought to ourselves, if only we could begin to predict, we could begin to understand human genes in a way that we could predict things like height, complex features like height, hair color, or even more complex features that we'll talk about in a second, then we would begin to understand genetic risk for diseases, cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, neurological diseases. Then we would begin to find deep ways of thinking about these diseases. This field sat kind of in a silence for a long time, and then something happened. Powerful computers began to read our own genomes. Using genetic information alone, you should be able to tell what final height your child is going to be before your child is ever born. What if I said, I found a similar algorithm for a lethal neurological disease, 50% chance that your child will have a lethal neurological disease by age 20. Would you like to know this information? And what if I said then to you, cancer risk? I would start predicting cancer risk. Would you want to know the future cancer risk of your unborn child? Anyone? These are extraordinarily important questions, and they're already coming. This is not science fiction, it's not fantasy. This is coming your way. This is the new world that we're trying to bring along. But knowing this information would make you a previvor. Knowing this information would force you, willingly in this case, to enter a world in which you were under surveillance, presumably. You might take medicines, presumably. You might decide to change your behavior. So this is the world. So when I put up this idea, it's not an abstraction. This is coming fundamentally to our world as we move forward. We are now also extending our concerns beyond genes and genomes. We're thinking about things that are outside the tumor. Many of you have heard about immunotherapy, the idea that you can use the immune system now to kill the cancer cell. We're thinking about what the tissue, the organ, the host is. Somewhere here is the question of the diet. What are we eating? How are we feeding ourselves? What do those molecules do to cancer cells? And of course, one big question is this so-called microbiome, the bacteria that live in our body. How do they alter our relationship with cancer? But more and more we are realizing that for places outside the very narrow ecosystem of the United States, we can't think of cancer like this anymore. How do you broaden the base of the pyramid so that you can concentrate less and less on the narrow tip of the pyramid where it's all focused on the delivery of treatment? But that, of course, creates the idea that all of us become previvors. We become previvors of a disease that we are yet to have. And we enter, thereby, a world of surveillance, of diagnostic surveillance, of an imagination of a future disease. We are creating, medicine is becoming a total institution. We're creating a universe or a cosmos in which we are subjecting ourselves to becoming under surveillance for diseases that we haven't yet had. We are willing to take our children, potentially sequence their genomes, understand their risks, understand their future fates based on ideas that are very enveloping, because we then mark them for future fates. And it's something to be careful of as we try to go forward in a world, hopefully, where we have many, many new mechanisms of progress to decrease the risk of terrible diseases such as cancer. Thank you very much.
Conecte-se com grandes nomes da área da saúde e dos negócios.
Matricule-se na pós-graduação de Nutrologia. O profissional da Nutrologia atua na avaliação das necessidades nutricionais humanas, a fim de diminuir a probabilidade do desenvolvimento de doenças e preservar o estado de saúde.
As aulas contarão com grandes nomes da área da gestão e saúde que compartilharão seus conhecimentos práticos e teóricos. Este é o seu time de professores.
Felipe Savioli, professor da pós-graduação de Nutrologia do Hospital Albert Einstein. Sérgio Loz, coordenador do Departamento de Nutrologia do Hospital Moinhos de Vento. Rafael Del Roio Júnior, pós-doutor em Endocrinologia Pediátrica pela FMRP USP. Paulo Lara, médico nutrólogo e membro da ABESO. Humberto Nicastro, especialista em nutrição esportiva.
l'homme public que je suis, devenu malgré moi dans des circonstances que je n'ai pas choisies, n'est animé que par un seul objectif, être un défenseur de la vie, être au service des vulnérables, faire et transmettre les biens dans un monde malheureusement où l'inversion des valeurs a assailli par la banalité et du mal. Je suis né le 1er mars 1955 comme le 3e enfant, mais le premier garçon de la famille. Mes premiers jours dramatiques en raison d'un accouchement qui s'était tout simplement mal déroulé il y a plus de 64 ans. Et en jugé par les récits de ma mère, l'erreur se produisit lorsque le cordon ombilical devrait être sectionné. La sage-femme qui aidait ma mère faisait tout de travers. Elle avait ainsi ouvert la porte à tous les microbes, la plaie commençant à saigner puis suppurer. Il s'ensuivit une grave infection généralisée. Au bout d'une semaine, la couleur de ma peau vira au jaune et la fièvre fut intense. Ma mère m'enveloppa dans un pagne, me prit dans ses bras et descendit à pied vite vers le centre de santé. Mon état était critique, ma vie n'était née qu'à un fil. Après une 3e dose de pénicilline, il y eut des premiers signes encourageants. Ma respiration devint plus calme et très vite, ma jeune existence a repris le cours de la vie. Et lorsque je raconte cette histoire, souvent j'ai des frissons puisque 60 ans plus tard, malheureusement, les infections néonatales continuent à tuer dans mon pays. Et moi, je suis un survivant. Toute mon enfance, j'étais en admiration à l'égard de toutes celles ou tous ceux qui s'occupaient des autres, à l'instar de mon père. Il était un pasteur protestant et qui n'hésitait pas à aller assister toute personne qui avait besoin de lui. Sa compassion et son amour pour ses fidèles, ses paroissiers et surtout pour les malades, c'est un véritable fil conducteur de sa vie, ont été une profonde source d'inspiration pour moi, pour venir au secours des autres, de ceux qui en ont le plus besoin. Un jour, alors que j'aimais bien accompagner mon père quand il rendait visite aux gens, un jour, je décide de les suivre pour aller rendre visite à un enfant souffrant. Cet enfant fébrile, convulsé, il allait très très mal. Et la mère de cet enfant avait tendu cet enfant à mon père pour que mon père prie pour cet enfant. Mon père fit sa prière et après la prière, mon père tendit, remit l'enfant à la mère et mon père dit au revoir. Alors là, je suis pris par un sentiment non seulement d'injustice, mais d'incompréhension. Parce que mon père, quand moi j'étais malade, il me donnait le médicament et je pose la question à mon papa, pourquoi cet enfant, vous priez et puis après avoir prié, vous ne donnez pas le médicament et vous partez? Mon père va me répondre en me tapotant sur les épaules, Denis, moi je ne suis pas médecin. Eh bien, cette réponse, à 8 ans, je réalise que mon père, il y a des choses qu'il ne peut pas faire, il n'est pas médecin. Et j'ai dit à mon père, tout naïvement, je serai médecin. Il y avait une chose que j'étais sûr, je voulais devenir une personne en blouse blanche qui distribue des médicaments, qui sauve des vies et qui est capable de pouvoir faire ce que mon père ne pouvait pas faire pour ces pauvres enfants qui étaient fébriles et souffrants. À partir de ces sacerdoces de mon père, qui ne voyait aucun autre sens à la vie que d'être utile et d'apporter des solutions à la souffrance des autres, j'ai vite compris que le sens de ma vie était de concentrer mon existence à aider les autres, puisque moi-même, j'avais été aidé. en apprenant l'histoire par ma mère. Tel est le fil d'Ariane du sens de mon combat. Être au service des autres, se soucier du bien-être des autres, sauver les vies, peu importe les prix à payer. Puisque nous devons savoir que lorsque nous prenons un engagement dans la vie, il y a toujours un prix à payer. Inspiré par l'expérience de mon père, incité par l'histoire de mon enfance et indigné par les hauts taux de mortalité infantile dans mon pays, je n'ai eu qu'un seul but, changer cette fatalité, faire en sorte que l'enfant qui naît en République démocratique du Congo puisse avoir cette assurance de pouvoir survivre. À la fin de mes études de médecine générale au Burundi et ma thèse en pédiatrie sur la vaccination contre l'hépatite virale B chez les nouveau-nés, je suis parti à Lemera, à une centaine de kilomètres de Bukavu. Lemera, c'est un village paisible, tapi, confiné entre le Rwanda et le Burundi, offrait ce cadre idyllique pour mener ces combats contre la mortalité infantile dans le Kivu, tellement les milliers étaient reculés, abandonnés, où en fait personne ne voulait aller. Une fois installés dans ces villages, nous avons commencé à construire par des moyens de bord des centres de santé. Et puis finalement, on s'était rendu compte qu'on avait des centres, mais on n'avait pas du personnel. On a construit une école d'infirmerie pour former les infirmières et infirmiers pour conjurer la mortalité infantile en pleine campagne où j'étais seul médecin. Je vais découvrir une autre vérité. C'est ces femmes qu'on a portées sur des brancards qui ont saigné à blanc, inanimées, et donc une mortalité maternelle tout simplement très très élevée. Je n'avais jamais vu ça à l'université là où j'avais étudié. Presque 2 femmes chaque jour venaient déjà mortes. Le constat de la mortalité maternelle était triste. J'avais en effet rencontré une situation que je ne savais pas, que je ne pouvais pas imaginer, que les femmes puissent perdre leur vie en donnant la vie. Quel contraste, quel paradoxe. Pour moi, il devint dès lors évident que je me spécialiserais en gynéco-obstétrique. Après ma spécialisation en France, malgré une carrière confortable qui s'offrait à moi, j'ai alors décidé de revenir à mon engagement premier, lutter contre la mortalité maternelle et infantile en zone rurale. Ce fut à ce moment-là, donc, le deuxième jour le plus important de ma vie, après celui de ma naissance, car c'est à ce moment-là, comme d'ailleurs le disait si bien Marc Taïwan, en ce jour, ma vocation m'a été dictée. Concentrer ma vie à la santé et aux droits des femmes. Ces femmes qui mouraient en donnant la vie m'avaient tellement marqué que j'ai fait ça comme un engagement. Et pendant plus de 25 ans, je me suis démené pour que dans la province du Sud Kivu où j'ai travaillé et dont je suis originaire d'ailleurs, les femmes puissent accoucher dans un hôpital ou dans une clinique et sauver le maximum de vies humaines. Mais ce second combat contre la mortalité maternelle dans la zone de santé rurale de Lemera fut de très courte durée avec l'évasion du Zaïre d'alors sur les cendres du génocide rwandais. À l'image de l'hôpital de Kunduz en Afghanistan, l'hôpital de Lemera avait été attaqué en violation de normes élémentaires du droit international et humanitaire. La fosse commune dans laquelle sont enterrés mes patientes et une partie de mon personnel témoigne et rappelle la cruauté et la banalité du mal. L'invasion de Lemera fut le signe précurseur de 2 conflits les plus meurtriers d'Afrique. Le bilan de ces pogroms oubliés où le viol a été utilisé comme arme de guerre est sans appel. Plus de 6 millions de Congolais, hommes, femmes, enfants, sont morts et sans sépulture suite à des exécutions sommaires, des assassinats multiples, des viols systématiques, des exodes forcés, des massacres, des tortures, des milliers d'enfants forcés de prendre les chemins d'exil ou tout simplement les armes contre leur propre peuple. Beaucoup n'ont pas eu même la chance d'échapper à la tourmente de cet énième programme du XXIe siècle. Le pire, c'est qu'un vent de sable et de négation a toujours soufflé sur ce meurtre massif et inhumain. Plusieurs voix et différents gouvernements successifs se sont succédés dans un négationnisme construit sur l'amnésie et sur les silences complices et coupables de la communauté internationale lorsque celle-ci se flagelle sur les 800 000 morts de l'autre côté du lac Kivu, sur les terribles génocides rwandais que nous déplorons, mais qui ne peut pas justifier en aucun cas le silence coupable au sujet des atrocités des masses commises en République démocratique du Congo. Plus de des décennies après, les crimes commis à l'hôpital de l'Emera sur mes malades, sur le personnel sous ma responsabilité, n'a jamais été reconnu ni jugé. Les enquêteurs des Nations Unies ont publié des rapports et des témoignages en listant et répertoriant 617 crimes contre l'humanité authentifiés par les juristes et les experts des crimes contre l'humanité dans les rapports mapping. Malgré ces rapports, la communauté internationale a jusqu'ici préféré jouer plutôt la carte de la réelle politique. La voix des institutions régionales et internationales n'a jamais été aussi silencieuse à l'épopée des martyrs congolais, n'a jamais été chantée par aucun Homer d'Afrique, de l'Europe ou d'ailleurs. Face à ces cynismes, face à cette souffrance, faut-il se résigner dans ces contextes de conflits barbares? Certainement non. Mais il m'a fallu 2 ans. J'avais peur d'opérer. J'avais peur de retourner dans la salle d'accouchement. J'avais peur tout simplement de reprendre mon activité médicale puisque, comme vous pouvez vous imaginer, vous opérez un malade pendant 2-3 heures et que quelqu'un vienne tirer à bout portant dans sa bouche, dans sa partie génitale, c'est quelque chose qui vous tue. Et pour moi, il a fallu 2 ans avant que très rapidement, je poursuive mon combat. Et ici, cette fois-ci, je décide de ne pas le faire à l'Emera où c'était devenu une zone militarisée, impossible de continuer. Et donc, je vais poursuivre mon combat ailleurs. Nous avons construit encore un hôpital pour continuer ce combat de lutte contre la mortalité maternelle et infantile. Un hôpital aujourd'hui qu'on appelle l'hôpital des Panzi et qui aura 20 ans d'existence le 1er septembre prochain, donc dans une semaine. Notre première patiente n'est pas venue pour donner la vie, alors que notre objectif, c'était de combattre la mortalité maternelle et infantile. Mais cette première patiente, elle est venue puisqu'elle avait été violée avec une extrême violence, alors que nous pensions ici, lorsque nous l'examinons et nous voyons les plaies qu'elle porte sur sa partie génitale, complètement émiettée, échiquetée, nous pensions avoir affaire à un cas isolé. Malheureusement, ce que nous pensions n'était que faux, puisqu'après nous avons vu une multitude de cas similaires affluer à l'hôpital il y a 20 ans. Mais je dois dire avec un cœur serré, un cœur triste, jusqu'avant que je vienne ici, je continue à opérer puisque les malades continuent à affluer à l'hôpital dans ces conditions. Les corps des femmes étaient devenus un champ de bataille. Et c'est avec effroi que nous avons découvert une nouvelle arme terrible, bon marché mais redoutablement efficace. Les viols commis avec extrême violence, utilisés comme une arme de guerre et une méthode systématique pour détruire des communautés. Ces viols sont loin d'être un besoin de satisfaire des désirs sexuels. Ils sont le fruit d'une planification de chaque groupe armé engagé dans les conflits avec un mode opératoire propre. Chaque groupe armé a son propre mode opératoire de torture physique et psychologique et même, je dirais, des tortures même communautaires pour humilier la communauté et détruire le tissu social. Les femmes sont violées collectivement avec les risques élevés de contamination du VIH-Sida et des maladies sexuellement transmissibles. Les organes génitaux sont souvent mutilés. Sous menace de mort et sans tenir compte des liens de consanguinité, les hommes sont parfois forcés de violer les femmes dans l'unique et seul but de traumatiser psychologiquement et physiquement la communauté en détruisant les repères sociaux. Quelle stratégie de guerre postmoderne se déroule sur le corps des femmes? Les viols et les violences sont de plus en plus utilisés comme une stratégie de guerre, de domination et même de terreur. Ce que nous vivons depuis 1999 à l'hôpital de Panzi dépasse tout simplement l'entendement. Près de 100 000 patientes, dont presque 55 000 survivantes de violences sexuelles, et plus de 45 000 patientes souffrant de pathologies gynécologiques graves, puisqu'elles n'ont pas d'accès aux soins dans la forêt équatoriale congolaise. Et ici, nous soignons les fistures urogénitales, ont été non seulement soignées, mais aussi prises en charge économiquement et psychologiquement. Les viols n'ont épargné ni les personnes âgées, ni les bébés. L'horreur a atteint son comble avec le cas de cette opération d'une vieille femme de 80 ans qui d'ailleurs me demandait pourquoi vous me traitez, laissez-moi mourir, ou cette petite fille d'à peine 6 mois que moi-même, en l'opérant, j'ai senti que j'ai perdu toute la force d'un chirurgien. Le souvenir le plus pénible fut également cette nuit de la Saint-Sylvestre, mieux un traumatisme quand toutes les femmes et les jeunes filles d'un village ont été soumises à l'indicible devant leurs maris et leurs enfants. On ne viole pas 200, 300 femmes dans un village sans qu'il y ait une planification préalable. En moyenne, 10 femmes victimes de violences sexuelles sont consultées chaque jour à l'hôpital de Panzi. Partageons-nous encore vraiment la même humanité? Ça, c'est la question qui me torture. Que faire face à cette violence inouïe, à toutes ces formes de violence physique, psychologique et sociale? Nous n'avons d'autre choix que de répondre par l'amour, la prise en charge médicale, psychologique, judiciaire, économique, et essayer de réinsérer ces femmes sur le plan socio-économique. On est loin de se limiter à cette prise en charge. Il faut briser les tabous, sortir des complexes de victimisation pour amener les femmes à devenir des actrices à part entière dans la société. Ainsi, par-delà toutes ces prises en charge, l'autonomisation et le leadership des femmes restent les seules armes pour transformer leur victimisation en victoire, leur souffrance en force et en pouvoir pour retrouver les chemins de la dignité bafouée par ces actes barbares. Mesdames et messieurs, de tout ce qui précède, il est plus qu'évident que le sens de ma vie, au-delà de sauver la vie des femmes, de par ma vocation médicale, reste toujours et surtout le combat contre le fléau des violences sexuelles pour restaurer la dignité des femmes. Mais ces combats restent moindres. C'est une goutte d'eau par rapport au courage et à la résilience des femmes à renaître de leurs cendres pour continuer le long chemin de la liberté, de la justice et de la dignité. Mais à partir des années 2010, un tournant s'est imposé à moi pour poursuivre ces combats. Ce tournant s'est produit lorsque nous avons été confrontés à la deuxième génération des victimes. Dès lors, nous sommes engagés dans notre travail de plaidoyer et nous avons parcouru le monde pour alerter l'opinion internationale sur la gravité de la situation qui de loin dépasse une crise humanitaire pour tout simplement se confondre avec une crise de notre humanité. Les femmes n'ont qu'une seule aspiration, et n'ont qu'un seul desiderata, c'est la paix. Tel est leur credo pour vaquer à leurs occupations, pour nourrir et éduquer leurs enfants. Mais cette paix tant désirée ne sera pas possible sans la lutte contre l'impunité qui prévaut déjà depuis trop longtemps en matière de crimes à caractère sexuel, et c'est tant au niveau domestique qu'international. Il est temps de donner la parole aux femmes. Il est temps de les écouter. Il est temps de leur faire justice au nom de notre commune humanité. Le récent verdict de condamnation de la Cour pénale internationale du chef de guerre Bosco Ntaganda pour diverses préventions de violences sexuelles reconnues comme crimes de guerre et crimes contre l'humanité est un précédent encourageant. Ce verdict de condamnation est une goutte d'eau dans la mer eu égard à ce qui s'est passé dans le Grand Lac, en Irak et ailleurs, dans un contexte où l'impunité prévaut largement. Les violences sexuelles n'épargnent personne. Elles peuvent toucher de près ou de loin nos mères, nos filles, nos sœurs. Elles ne sont que des archétypes de violences latentes qui affectent les femmes partout dans le monde en période de paix. Les femmes sont l'avenir de l'humanité. Fini le modèle de la masculinité dominante et l'ordre patriarcal pour que triomphe la masculinité positive. Pas de fatalité, pas de passivité. Le volontarisme des campagnes telles que MeToo, Brisons le silence, ni Unamas ont réussi à changer le cours des choses. Un monde meilleur et plus juste, un monde 50-50 est possible et à notre portée. N'être femme n'est pas une malédiction, au rebours une richesse. Mettons-nous à leur côté pour guérir notre monde blessé à cause de l'aliénation et de la domination des 50% de l'humanité. Il y a des choix que nous faisons aujourd'hui qui sauveront nos propres vies demain. Ces choix, c'est les choix de l'égalité du genre. C'est les choix de la justice et la réparation. C'est les choix de la masculinité positive. Un monde sans violence est possible. Un monde sans violence sexuelle et sexiste, sans discrimination raciale et religieuse est à notre portée. Engageons-nous dans cette lutte et donnons un sens à notre vie. Je vous remercie. Merci.
Conecte-se com grandes nomes da área da saúde e dos negócios. Matricule-se na pós em Gestão e Planejamento Financeiro para profissionais e clínicas de saúde. As aulas contarão com grandes nomes da área da gestão e saúde que compartilharão seus conhecimentos práticos e teóricos. Este é o seu time de professores. Paul Krugman, Prêmio Nobel de Economia. Alexandre Schwartzman, economista brasileiro, ex-diretor de Relações Internacionais do Banco Central. Daniel Goleman, maior referência em inteligência emocional do mundo. Edgar Abreu, mestre em economia, pioneiro em preparatórios para certificações. Felipe Miranda, CEO e estrategista-chefe da Empíricos. Mohamed Parrini, CEO Hospital Moinhos de Vento. Nossas aulas são 100% online e multidisciplinares, proporcionando maior capacitação pessoal e profissional.
So what I'd like to talk to you about tonight is this thing, liberty. And I like to use drugs to contemplate our own liberty. Now, it's important for us to understand that I'm talking about drugs tonight specifically because drugs are my expertise. But this is much bigger than drugs. This is about liberty, and liberty is the thing that allows us to be human. And drugs is just one tool to talk about liberty, and I'm talking about drugs in part because I wrote a book recently, and it was about drugs. And this book is a book geared towards grown-ups, people who are adults. One of the things we like to do in societies like yours and mine is that whenever we're talking about drugs, we like to say, what about the kids? And we say that to shut down the conversation. Now, there are activities in a society in which kids, they must live with grown-up activities, like sexual intercourse. When we are thinking about sexual intercourse, and we are talking about how to do it better and what have you, no one says, what about the kids? We can't do that because of the kids. That's ridiculous. And the same is true when we're talking about drugs. This is a grown-up adult conversation, and I will treat you like an adult, and I just will appreciate if you do the same with me. Good? All right. So I've been thinking about liberty, as I said, and I think about all of the countries in which I traveled to. Liberty is one of the fundamental things that's mentioned in their sort of constitution or the founding of the country. Your constitution guarantees people who live in this country liberty. Everyone has the right to liberty, this right that can't be taken away. Now, when I say liberty, all I mean is that people have the right to live their life as they see fit. Now, that does not mean that your liberties or my liberties supersede your liberties. No, it's part of liberty means that you are responsible such that my rights do not or cannot interfere with your ability to pursue your liberty. That's real liberty. And so in my country, we have people who say things like, I refuse to get vaccinated or I don't want to wear a mask. If you're in the public space, you can't do that because your liberty then starts to impact other people's liberty. It would be like going to a public swimming pool and taking a poop in the pool. That's not right. I cannot do that because I will interfere with other people's liberty. So when I talk about liberty, I mean your ability to live your life as you see fit, so long as you do not interfere with other people's ability to do the same. So that's what I mean when I say liberty. Do we understand each other? We're good? Okay. Now, in order to talk about this, my agenda tonight, I want to show how our sort of promise of liberty in societies like yours, our promise does not square with our practice. We say we guarantee liberty, but we don't actually behave in that manner as a society. And that's what I like to talk about tonight as it relates to drugs. And my agenda is I will talk about some of the drug myths. These drug myths are partly responsible for why we live in this inconsistent manner where our promise does not match our practice. And then I'll talk about some of the drug realities, what's real. And then I will talk about how we can make things right. Now, the position that I will take tonight is not a position that I have always held. It's a relatively new position for me. It's a position that I came to in writing the current book. In writing that book, I went on a journey. I went on an intellectual journey. And as one of my favorite authors, James Baldwin, has said, speaking of journeys, he says that you cannot know what you will discover on the journey, what you will do with what you find, or what you find will do to you. And that's what happened to me. I didn't know what I would find. I didn't know what it would do to me. I found some things that profoundly changed me. And I'll share with you some of my personal story in order to make it interesting, in order to illuminate some of the ideas. I hope this helps to make it clear and also interesting. So we'll start back in the 1980s. I was in the US military. I carried an M16 assault rifle in the protection of the country. I served in Japan and in the UK. And then once I got out of the military, I wanted to know how else I could serve my community. At the time, in the US, we're talking the mid to late 1980s, we thought that crack cocaine was the biggest problem that faced communities like the one in which I came, poor community. So we were told that crack was destroying the community. And so what I decided to do was to study psychology and neuroscience such that I figured that if I could figure out how to treat drug addiction, then I could solve some of the problems that I thought were caused in my community by drugs. So I figured that this neurobiological sort of understanding would give me a special insight into solving drug addiction. And so almost 30 years ago, that's exactly what I did. Along the way, I discovered some things that changed my perspective about how I initially felt. I initially felt that we should control these drugs as tightly and vigorously as we possibly could, and I thought that people should be arrested for drug use, drug trafficking, the wide range of these things. Now, along the way, I discovered that many of the things that I believed were in fact myths. And I want to share with you some of those myths. One of the most pervasive myths is this myth, that drug addiction is inevitable and unpredictable. That is, anybody who uses drugs like cocaine, heroin, even cannabis, those people would eventually become addicted to drugs. That's what I believe. Turns out, 70 to 90% of people who use any of those drugs never become addicted. Turns out those people are responsible, they are decent, good people, they take care of their families, they pay their taxes, they contribute to their community in terms of being volunteers. They sometimes become president of the United States. All three of these men on the board, Barack Obama, George Bush II, Bill Clinton, all three of these men used drugs when they were young men. And they went on to become president. We can argue about the actual job they did as president, but the facts remain that they went on to serve their community in a way that some people think it's admirable, right? So what's the point? Well, the point, these guys claim not to have used drugs. And arguably, both of them have been said to be, both of them are cognitively impaired. So maybe the point is that they probably should have used drugs, huh? No, that's not the point. That's not the point. The point is this. The point is this. If the vast majority of users of any drug don't become addicted, then we can't blame drugs for drug addiction. It means that we have to look beyond the drugs to try to determine what's going on when people actually become addicted. Everybody understand that point? That's an important and profound point, one that I didn't completely understand, even after many years of studying drugs. So when we think about, well, if it's not the drugs, then what is causing addiction? Factors that are important for addiction are known, obvious, and there is substantial research evidence supporting these factors. And these factors are things like co-occurring mental illness, co-occurring physical illnesses, like people in pain, people who meet criteria for a mental disorder like anxiety disorder, schizophrenia, depression, are much more likely to meet criteria for drug addiction as well. People who are in pain that's not being treated well are much more likely to meet addiction for something like drugs as well. So the point is that if you treat these other illnesses, that will go a long way in dealing with problems that we have attributed to drugs and drug addiction. Another sort of issue that's related to drug addiction is this issue of poverty, whether it's intellectual poverty, whether it's economic poverty. These sorts of things also correspond or correlate with drug addiction. Again, if you address these issues in your society, that goes a long way in dealing with drug addiction. We can also think about people who are subjected on a chronic basis to unrealistic expectations. That also increases the likelihood of people meeting criteria for drug addiction. These are things that there is substantial evidence to support, but the problem with these things is that they're just not sexy. And so as a result, we don't really highlight these issues. But this is where the action really is when we think about why people meet criteria for drug addiction. We like to typically focus on the brain when we think about drug addiction. And one of the sort of most prominent perspectives in the field today is that addiction is a brain disease. Again, this is one of these big myths that I learned along the way. I started studying drugs in the late 80s, early 90s. In the US, between the years of 1990 and the years 2000, that 10-year period, we proclaimed that period to be the decade of the brain. We pumped a lot of money into brain studies. In fact, I got a PhD as a result of that proclamation. That proclamation funded my PhD studies. And we learned a lot about the brain, and we continue to do so. But one of the things that was said was that drug addiction is a brain disease. And one of the main proponents of this perspective was the former director of the US's National Institute on Drug Abuse. His name is Alan Leshner. Alan Leshner wrote a paper in Science. He published this editorial in '97 in Science. And in this editorial entitled "Addiction is a Brain Disease and It Matters," what Alan Leshner said that addiction is tied to changes in brain structure and function is what makes it fundamentally a brain disease. In this paper, Alan Leshner had no data. This was mainly just speculation. But this particular paper, it has been cited hundreds of times, and it's highly influential. But again, the thing that we must remember about science and the beauty of science is that in science, the only currency is data. Without data, then you may as well be a politician. You may as well just be someone who has a position. And that paper, there was no data, but it still didn't matter because it really had a profound influence on the field, and it also shaped the current sort of dominant perspective that drug addiction is a brain disease. It had such a profound influence on the field that even today, in our diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, which we typically call the DSM-5, in this manual that has a list, it lists all of the mental disorders and the symptoms that one must endorse in order to meet criteria for a specific disorder. In this manual, it says about drug addiction, or in the manual, it's called substance use disorders. It says that, and an important characteristic of substance use disorders is an underlying change in brain circuits that may persist beyond detoxification, particularly in individuals with severe disorders. So this is in our Bible, if you will, of mental disorders. There is absolutely no way to measure whether or not there has been changes in brain circuits unless you give everyone at birth or at some very young age an MRI or a PET scan or some neural imaging. We don't do that. We haven't done that. We don't have the resources to do that sort of things. And by the way, the current technology wouldn't be able to tell us whether or not a change is pathological or not. And so this statement about underlying changes in brain circuits, this is in the most important sort of diagnostic tool in psychiatry today. And there is no ability to measure what is said. And no one seems to be bothered by this. This is a huge violation or a huge gap it's important for us to keep in mind. Now, when we think about brain diseases, and we think about substance use disorders being a brain disease, I like to make the comparison with well-established brain diseases like Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease. In these diseases, one of the things that we know is that these diseases are progressive. That means that they get progressively worse. The person gets progressively worse, and they are irreversible until the person eventually dies, sadly. That's what happens with these brain diseases. Also, with these brain diseases, you can see atrophy in specific regions, neuronal atrophy, particularly as the disorder progresses towards this state towards this awful state that leads to fatality. So you can see that with these disorders. When it comes to substance use disorders, most people recover without any medical treatment. Furthermore, there are no neuronal correlates of substance use disorders. That is, you can't look at the brains of someone who meets criteria for drug addiction or substance use disorder and look at the brains of someone else who doesn't meet criteria for that disorder and differentiate those people on the basis of what you see in their brains. You can't do it. And so when we think about brain diseases, comparing substance use disorders with other brain diseases, it just doesn't match. Now I've said a lot, and I haven't really shown you any data about what related to what I'm saying. So I feel it necessary for me to show you a science paper. This is a paper in which my colleagues and I reviewed the literature on people who met criteria for methamphetamine use disorder. And we reviewed the literature looking at brain imaging studies, cognitive studies, and we chose methamphetamine because with methamphetamine, amphetamines are drugs that can produce neurotoxicity at high doses, and they can produce neurotoxicity in a very predictable way, in a reliable way. And so we chose methamphetamine because we figured that if you're going to see some toxicity, you would definitely see it with this drug, more so certainly than with other drugs, because the amphetamines are better at producing toxicity than other drugs that people use, like heroin or cocaine. And so we looked at the literature on methamphetamine use disorder and people and the folks who meet criteria for methamphetamine use disorder. And what we found was that when you look at the neuroimaging studies, like MRIs studies, you didn't find any consistent differences between the methamphetamine users and non-users. We did find some consistent differences when you looked at PET imaging studies. PET is a type of imaging that is used. And we saw about a 10 to 20% sort of difference between people who use methamphetamine and folks who didn't use methamphetamine. Now, that 10 to 20% difference is important, the brains of those folks. It's important because when you see a difference, the question becomes, is the difference meaningful? So we can take the heights of, I don't know, the women who are here tonight. We can have women who are here tonight and we can compare their heights. Some women will be 5 feet, other women will be 5'2". And you can see that consistent difference. The question becomes, is that difference meaningful? Probably not, because you have some people who are tall, some people who are short. It's just how life is. The same is true when we see some of the PET imaging studies that have found differences, because both groups perform equally on cognitive tasks. They perform within the normal range. And so when we see a difference in the measure used for PET, it just simply means that you have normal variability. That's all it means. But the researchers in the field had been interpreting any difference as being pathological and meaningful, when in fact, there's no evidence for it being pathological or meaningful. So that's an important sort of thing for us to understand. It's important for us to understand that we have normal variation in our brain sort of measures in all of us, just like we have normal variation in height. Another important thing to take from that sort of study is that researchers consistently describe any difference as pathological. That's an exaggeration of the situation. So the question for me became, why do researchers overemphasize these differences? Well, some researchers may simply be erring on the side of caution. That is, they just want to make sure that they are not encouraging any use of these drugs, and so they're erring on the side of caution. But I think most researchers are emphasizing these negative effects because it is lucrative to emphasize these negative effects. That is, when you write a grant, when you write a paper that you want to get published, it helps you to highlight pathology, highlight a problem that you're going to solve. And when we think about the funding in this field, in my field, the main funding agency is the US's National Institute on Drug Abuse. They fund about 90% of the world's research in this area. And so their mission is to focus on drug pathology, a pathology after drug use or pathology related to drug use, the negative things that happens in response to drug use. That's their mission. That's what they do. And so the bottom line is that we as researchers are incentivized to exaggerate, to highlight the negative effects of drug use. And so as Upton Sinclair has aptly pointed out, he pointed out that it's difficult to get a man, and in this case a woman too, to understand something when his or her salary depends upon his or her not understanding. Do you all feel me? Right on. So that's an important point. It's always about the incentives. Rarely are people just evil or bad people. It's the incentives that we have in place that shape our behaviors. And that's what's going on in this case. The incentives for drug researchers is to overemphasize these negative drug effects. And that's what we get in the literature and so forth. The concern, however, is that there are real consequences to overemphasizing these negative consequences. These consequences include the fact that they allow authorities in all of our societies to scapegoat drugs in order to avoid dealing with real problems of the poor in our society. We can simply say drugs cause that and ignore all the other sort of factors, like the fact that people don't have jobs or the fact that people don't have an education. It also allows these authorities to target people that we don't like in a society without explicitly saying we don't like those people. If you can think back to our last president, for example, I don't really like to get political or to point out one sort of party versus another, because I think in my country, both parties have been awful on drugs. So this is not to say that the other party is better. But if you think about in my country, our last president used to love to target Mexican people to say that Mexicans were the bad people bringing drugs and so forth. And so these sort of the exaggerating of the negative effects of drugs allow authorities to engage in this kind of behavior. If you would please come with me to Asia, where the Philippines president, Rodrigo Duterte, has said that 1 year of use of methamphetamine would shrink a person's brain, and therefore the person is no longer viable for rehabilitation, meaning that we can exterminate the person, meaning that we can kill the person and get rid of the person. Thousands of people have been killed in the Philippines for suspected of using methamphetamine or selling methamphetamine. These are the real consequences of exaggerating the harmful effects of drugs. Now, when we think about your country, I know that it's a complicated thing because, as Antonio Jobim has said, Brazil isn't for beginners. I've been coming here since 2014, only about 7 years. So I realize that I am a beginner. And I have much to learn about this society. This society really perplexes me. On the one hand, it's such a beautiful place. particularly on Friday through Sunday when the party happens. It's such a beautiful place. But then on Monday through Friday, and when I see who's working and who's not working, it's horrifying. And I see the people who are being killed by police who look like me. It's horrifying. And so on the one hand, it's a beautiful place, and then on the other hand, it's a nightmare. And so when I think about this sort of drugs, the overemphasizing of these negative effects and what the authorities are doing with this knowledge, with this misinformation, I think about some of the statements made by politicians in your country when people like your president had said that the folks who are suspected of drug dealing and those sort of things, they should be shot in the street like cockroaches. And other authorities say things like the police, they urge police to aim at their little heads and fire. This sort of inflammatory language, these sort of statements are said because the population believes that drug cartels and drugs are causing the harms. And so politicians can get away with making statements like this. There are problems with those statements, with that logic, of course, and we'll continue to talk about the problems with that. But these inflammatory statements, they serve multiple purposes for these politicians. We think about a place like Rio where the police kill more than 1,000 people every year under the pretense of ridding those communities of drugs. This is how this information is used. And as I pointed out, who the victims are, usually poor, young, and black. And meanwhile, the real problems that people face, poverty, lack of education, lack of jobs, the real problems are ignored, and drugs are allowed to be scapegoated for these problems. And so that's one of the sort of things that I've discovered along the way. But I have to tell you, politicians or the authorities are not the only beneficiaries of this thing that I'm calling the war on drugs, or this exaggeration of drugs. Politicians are not the only beneficiaries. Law enforcement are beneficiaries. Their budgets are increased. Prison authorities' budgets are increased. So-called drug treatment centers, like in your country, you have these therapeutic communities that are largely staffed by unqualified religious people. They have no training to provide drug treatment, but yet they get most of the money. And so all of these people are benefiting. The media benefits. They tell these incredible stories about drugs, so you buy their papers, so you watch their television programs, and none of this stuff comports with reality. So media, the journalists, they benefit. People who do drug testing, they benefit when they do the urine testing. All of these folks are benefiting. The incentives are in place for these folks to benefit, and that's why it continues. Now, another drug myth is that poor people are the primary users of drugs. Now, you should know that the illicit drug trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's a lot of money. Poor people alone could not support this industry. Most of the people who are supporting this industry are middle class and upper class people. And so when we act as if this is a poor people endeavor, we miss the boat. This is not a poor people endeavor alone. Another myth is, some of you all may have been paying attention to what's going on in our country in terms of the opioid crises. And the myth is that opioids are the cause of the crises. That's simply not true. I just want to quickly talk about this because you don't really have this issue in this country, but I just wanted to raise it just in case people are aware of it and you might have it in your mind. It's important for you all to know that most of the people who are actually doing the counting of who died from an overdose are people who are what we call coroners. And these coroners, the only education that they are required to have is a high school diploma. Most people think that medical examiners are doing most of the counting and the death investigations. Medical examiners are physicians who have training in forensic pathology, but they're not the ones doing most of the death investigations. The folks who are primarily doing this are coroners, and these folks have typically a high school diploma. And in many jurisdictions, we don't even test for many drugs. And in other jurisdictions, we don't consistently test at all. And so when we're talking about something is an opioid overdose, it's just simply we don't typically have the evidence to prove it, in part because most of the overdose deaths that occur in the U.S., the person has had multiple drugs in their system. And it's really difficult to die from a single opioid unless it is something like fentanyl, which is a lot more potent than something like heroin. But that occurs because people don't know that they had fentanyl in their drug. And what we also know is that when people combine drugs like opioids with alcohol, it increases the likelihood of respiratory depression. And alcohol is almost completely ignored in this equation. And so it's important for us to understand that when we see those big numbers that the press say that people are dying from opioids, it's important to ask the question whether or not there was biological verification of an opioid being involved. Oftentimes, there is not. Okay, another myth is that psychedelic drugs are unique. I think you guys are aware that psychedelic drugs like psilocybin, ayahuasca, they have become chic in society, and people have been touting their experiences with these drugs in a positive way, which is a good thing on the one hand. But on the other hand, it's not good when people try to separate the psychedelic drugs from other drugs. As I will just quickly illustrate here on the slide, this slide contains PCP and ketamine. Ketamine is a drug that is FDA approved to treat depression in the United States. Ketamine is also used by some people to go on spiritual journeys or some quest. It has a positive sort of association with it. PCP, on the other hand, has negative association with it, and its use is associated with typically Black people who live in urban centers. Ketamine's use is associated with middle-class white Americans. So it's important for us to know, the main point I want you to know from this slide is that ketamine is made by altering the PCP structure. These drugs produce nearly identical effects. PCP's effects last somewhat longer than ketamine's effects. And PCP was used clinically as an anesthesia, just like ketamine was, still is actually. But PCP's effects just lasted too long. But the bottom line is that they produce nearly identical effects. Yet the narratives surrounding these drugs are wildly different. And so that's an important point for us to keep in mind. And I want to say another sort of comparison when we think of psychedelics versus those other drugs is methamphetamine compared with MDMA. And the proper name for MDMA, I've been told by the translator to slow down on when talking about drug names because I get excited because this is my favorite topic. But the proper name for MDMA is methylene dioxymethamphetamine. I say that name so you understand that MDMA is made from methamphetamine. The only difference between MDMA and methamphetamine is this methylene dioxy ring on the MDMA structure. That's the only difference. The drugs produce many overlapping effects, although they produce some distinct effects. And both drugs have potential therapeutic purposes. In fact, methamphetamine is approved in the United States to treat attention deficit disorder as well as to treat obesity. MDMA is not approved in the United States, although there have been some recent studies which have shown that MDMA is an effective treatment for PTSD. So we're hoping that that drug becomes FDA available at some point. The point is that methamphetamine has a negative sort of connotation associated with it compared to MDMA, which has a positive association. Methamphetamine is associated with poor white people in the United States, a group that we don't like in the United States, whereas MDMA is associated with middle to upper class, educated white folks. And so the stories or the narratives wildly differ between these two drugs, even though they produce many overlapping effects, and even though methamphetamine is FDA approved for a variety of ailments. Now, I want to talk here quickly about some of the drug realities, and then I will wrap up, and then we can have a discussion. Thank you for being so patient. Now, one of the things that I discovered in writing the latest book is that drug use is overwhelmingly a positive and life-enhancing sort of endeavor. I know, this was a bit surprising to me when I started studying drugs 30 years ago. But after giving people thousands of doses of drugs like crack cocaine, methamphetamine, cannabis in the lab, and seeing and watching the effects, documenting the effects, the immediate effects after giving the drugs, the long-term effects after decades of studying drugs and giving thousands of doses of drugs to people, I have come to this conclusion. Now, I want to make sure that we understand that we're having an adult conversation, in that there will be some people who say, well, my statement means that drugs don't produce any negative effects. That's not what I'm saying. All drugs has the potential to produce positive and negative effects both. But what I'm saying is that the overwhelming effects produced by the drugs that we so fear in this society, in our society, are positive. They are positive. And so when I travel to a place like anywhere in South America now, as differently as before, but now when I travel to a place like South America, Brazil being one of them, I'm surprised when people don't break out the cocaine. I guess that joke didn't translate well. I think the translator told me not to use any jokes because he said they wouldn't translate well. But you understand the point. You understand the point. The point is that these drugs produce overwhelmingly positive effects. And I can go through like a list of papers that we've done. We've shown this just to let you know I'm a scientist and this is all published and it's all available to the public. These are just some of the papers that we published with these drugs, but I won't go through the details of those papers now. Another reality related to drugs is that our prohibitionist policies, the ones that so restrict these drugs, those policies were motivated initially by racism and classism and not pharmacology. In the United States, for example, our first federal drug laws were passed in 1914. And this is just an article from the New York Times in 1914, where the author is an eminent physician, and he writes this article entitled "Negro Cocaine Fiends Are a New Southern Menace." He makes the argument that cocaine made black people superhuman, such that when you shot them with 32 caliber bullets, they were unaffected. He also argued that cocaine made black people better marksmen. They could shoot better. He also argued that cocaine made black people more murderous. These arguments were all put on the floor of our Congress when they passed the first drug laws. These arguments were persuasive in helping get past our first drug laws. Similar arguments were made about Chinese Americans as it related to the opioids. Similar arguments were made about Mexicans as it related to cannabis. They made arguments that indicated that cannabis made Mexicans crazy. These arguments motivated passage of our first drug laws in the United States. Today, those laws are used to subjugate not only black folks or Mexicans, but also poor white people in the United States. They are also equally being, some of their communities, devastated, not because of the drugs, but because of drug law enforcement. Another reality is that drug policy, globally in general, is inconsistent with many of these places' constitution that guarantees people the right to life and liberty. It's just inconsistent. If people actually had liberty, then why do we care what they put in their bodies, so long as they are not preventing other people from enjoying those same liberties? I know some people will say, well, when they do drugs, they get crazy. The evidence doesn't support that, but let's just say people did. We have laws that are already in place to punish people who harm other people. So why are we preventing folks from deciding how they would alter their consciousness? Why do we do that? That's a question for us as a society. Now, I think we can do something to make it right. I think we can make this right. We can simply regulate the sale and use of these sought-after drugs, just like we regulate the sale and use of things like tobacco and alcohol. We can do exactly the same thing. This would create numerous jobs in terms of making sure that we have quality control of the substance, sales, also making sure people are complying with the rules. All of these sort of things would enhance the number of jobs. In the US, we are seeing this now with cannabis. We have about 20 states that have legalized or legally regulated cannabis for adult use. And what we're seeing is that these states are generating millions and billions of dollars in profits from legally regulating cannabis. And they're creating jobs. And it's consistent with who we say we are. So if we legally regulate the market, we can begin to correct some of the extensive harms that our current policies are propagating. We can also begin to reconcile our inglorious past practices with the Constitution's guarantee of liberty. With that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Conecte-se com grandes nomes da área da saúde e dos negócios. Matricule-se na pós em Gestão da Experiência do Paciente. Novas pesquisas mostram uma correlação positiva entre a experiência do paciente e sua melhora clínica. Neste curso, o aluno terá a oportunidade de conhecer os vários aspectos que promovem uma boa experiência do paciente, abrangendo temas relativos à jornada do paciente dentro da organização de saúde. O curso possui uma duração de 12 meses. Tem o certificado da Faculdade Unimed em apenas 2 semestres e mude de vida. As aulas contarão com grandes nomes da área da gestão e saúde que compartilharão os seus conhecimentos práticos e teóricos. Este é o seu time de professores. Daniel Goleman, maior referência em inteligência emocional do mundo. Kowloon Wen, chefe da disciplina de telemedicina da FM USP, líder do grupo de pesquisa USP em telemedicina e health. Mohamed Bahini, CEO Hospital Moinhos de Vento. Kirsten Messenger, professora da Escola de Medicina de Harvard. Márcia Makidis, embaixadora de VBHC para o Brasil, da VBHC Center Europe. Bárbara Letícia Maia, doutora em enfermagem na área de cuidado da saúde em condição crônica. Nossas aulas são 100% online e multidisciplinares, proporcionando maior capacitação pessoal e profissional.